you would be a bad government and a bad spy agency if you weren't trying to get access to central government decision making.
Welcome to Crashed, a podcast about the internet, tech, and a conversation sadly lacking in British journalism, so we'll be awkward and passionate and angry, but factually accurate and informed, which makes a change. I'm Alex Hudson.
Chris Stoker-Walker.
How are you, Chris?
I'm all right. I am refreshed because I have gone on a 8-mile walk today. I felt very much like Eminem walking around the city of Durham because I have sat too long for too far on airplanes and things like that in recent weeks. So I need to get out and experience the natural environment. How about you?
Just a humble flex. You know, I've done so many I've spent so long in airplanes, spent so long flying around the world doing important journalism, finding out stories that no one else has, you know.
Yeah, well, I try, so I've been to, in the last 2 weeks, I have been to Estonia, where I was on a press trip, where I learned that Germans think that English journalists are incredibly lazy. I had an English journalist for Die Welt, which is the world, sidle up to me when we were stepping off a bus going to the UN Cyber Defence Centre of Excellence on the outskirts of Tallinn. And he basically said, I haven't seen any of you UK journalists actually doing any work on this trip. And I kind of felt very smug because I'd been doing a lot in the hotels and I had 6 stories ready to go. So I just kind of dropped them the next day and said, actually, here you go. But yeah, there is still some sort of kind of EU-UK divide going on, even in the world of tech journalism.
Of course there is. I mean, tech journalism is a struggling art form, as we are both finding out, but you particularly on the cliff edge,
a coal face, and also simultaneously the cliff edge, given the travails that the media industry is in at the minute, which is why it's always interesting to be doing this sort of stuff and trying to put the world to rights, I suppose.
Sorry, you asked a question. I am good. The main thing I've found out is that the NHS are trying to charge me £85 to have a COVID jab.
Ah.
That's what I found out today.
Are you not over the age of 75, Alex?
I am not, but I am asthmatic. Therefore, you are allowed a COVID jab until this winter, and you are not allowed a COVID jab unless you pay them £85.
I tried to do that during COVID. I tried to get a jab because I'm also asthmatic. Maybe this runs in the kind of tech adjacent journalism world where everybody has to be an asthmatic and kind of a little bit of a nerd. I tried to get a jab and pleaded, and they said, no, we don't even give them to asthmatics. So I'm glad that you got some. So are you going to get one then or not?
I am going to go full journalese on it and find out exactly the risks and go full social justice warrior, maybe make a story out of it, see what happens. Because the idea that you can't get a COVID jab unless you are vulnerable yourself is mad. When I have a elderly vulnerable parent and all of those. Anyway, it will be a hill that I will die on, and it is a cross that I will bear. So the format of this podcast, we're going to be trying it for a little while until either of us gets bored, or we make it huge, or no one listens, or all of the above. And it will be a tech podcast without it being about iPhones, without it being about generic tech journalism that all seems to be affiliate revenue based around how many different computers you can sell, and that's where journalism is at the moment. It will be difficult discussions about government policy, about tech startups, and about the nitty-gritty bits of technology policy and AI papers and white papers and inside government and inside the thinking of what's going on. And I managed to convince Chris to do this because he's one of the best brains in the business of all things tech. And I am just here to mainly steal his expertise and be the one asking all the questions and all of those sorts of things. But if you have any questions yourself, get in touch. We will try and answer them as best we can in our full journalistic rigor, endeavours, all of those things. Facts are a wonderful thing, as they often get ignored.
So like the way that you downplayed all of your expertise and skill in building up an awful lot of stuff around tech there. But that's nice. You can be very false and modest if you want. But yes, actually, you will be weighing in as much as I will on this sort of stuff. I am certain of.
Of course, but I will either do the sort of wholly modest, I don't know anything, or I'll go into the sort of rabbit hole and pretend that I am the leading expert in all of these things. You only get the two. You don't get the sort of correct amount of, what's the word? Modesty?
Yeah, well, we're podcasters,
Arrogance?
right? We're two male podcasters launching a podcast. Therefore, we cannot have modesty or anything like that. We have to
In 2025?
lather.
We're so innovative. We're so innovative.
So we're only jumping on this train about 5 years too late. But actually, what we're doing is something different, and so that will be quite interesting. And hopefully, we'll have you sticking around.
So the format will be ever changing. This is episode 1. So if you are coming back to this in years to come, or if you are a brand spanking early new listener, then fantastic, wonderful. But the format is we're going to cover the news as it comes to us this week. We're going to pick up a big story and try and make it make sense, or try and figure out what on earth is the story behind it. And we're going to do a deep dive in a longer term issue that has just popped up. And anything else that comes up, this is not going to be the final format, but we'll see where you end up. So first week, the Online Safety Act has found its first victim. So regulator Ofcom has fined Image Board, which is not really doing 4chan it's doing 4chan a bit dirty. I mean, I've seen it being called infamous, I've seen it called offensively controversial. Image Board 4chan. It's been fined £20,000 for ignoring Online Safety Act regulations, which essentially comes down to them not answering requests for their policies. 4chan has ignored Ofcom's request for a copy of its legal harms risk assessments. It will then be fined another £100 a day for up to 60 days as a daily penalty until they hear something from 4chan. Then it could be blocked in the UK. Ofcom said in a statement it could be fined up to £18 million or 10% of its revenue, whichever is higher. And the funny thing of that actually is that Ofcom's complaint comes from the fact that 4chan won't tell them how much they make in revenue. So, it doesn't know how much to fine them.
I think I can probably just say there safely, Alex, that it is not going to be £18 million of revenue that 4chan is turning over in any way, shape or form.
How much does 4chan make?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I can say pretty confidently that it is probably not turning over at least £18 million of revenue, or 10% of it, whichever is higher. So I think, when we're talking about this, £26,000, which is the maximum fine that they're looking at the minute, is probably a decent chunk of change anyway for the site's overheads.
And it's the first one of the Online Safety Act. They are currently conducting, well, it's now 16, but it was until the other day, 11 investigations across 69 platforms, which I thought was hilarious because most of them are pornography sites. So the fact that it is 69 platforms is someone in Ofcom has a sense of humour. But Chris, you sort of said that you were so passionate about how stupid this is, or how angry this has made you, and I'm really keen to find out more about it.
You're just going to wind me up and let me go then, Alex. Okay, so that's how we're going to do this. That is totally fine. So the Online Safety Act is in many ways a really good thing that the UK is doing. I think that actually it is a bit off the mark in terms of what it is actually trying to achieve and how it's going about it, not least because it has effectively just lined the pockets of the VPN industry by ensuring that people cannot access porn websites without getting on. And obviously an awful lot of people do like to access porn websites. So they are getting a VPN rather than hand over their ID to MindGeek or whoever it is going to be. So, we have to look at it in light of the fact that the Online Safety Act is a world-leading bit of legislation, as DSIT, the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, and the UK government writ large will constantly hammer home to us day in, day out in press releases and statements. But if you are trying to show this landmark bit of legislation that is world-leading in many ways to the world, I'm not entirely sure that, as you said, controversial Image Board 4chan is necessarily the first person that you should be picking on. And actually, if we look at this, it's just bizarre because 4chan are known. If there's one thing that people know about 4chan, and many people might not know about 4chan, our listeners probably do because actually, they are very tech literate, but an awful lot of people don't. It is that they are just completely anti-authority. And so the idea that they were ever going to listen to what Ofcom is saying was ridiculous. And so this is doomed to fail. You've worked in newspapers and in the news industry for an awful long time. We both know that you do not launch a campaign very publicly on the front page of your newspaper or the front page of your news website unless you are certain that it is going to succeed. The one thing we can say about this is that Ofcom's attempt to try and get 4chan to pay up is absolutely not going to succeed. It is doomed to failure, and then all that will happen is we will point and laugh and go, well, of course the internet trolls are not going to pay you all of this money because they don't even recognize your authority. So it's nobbling the kind of main regulator of the Online Safety Act in their very first action, and I just don't understand why they're doing it.
So we did ask 4chan for comment because we are both journalists. They have not responded, obviously. But a lawyer for 4chan, Ronald Coleman, has previously told the BBC that the legislation threatens the free speech rights of every American. They have filed a counter lawsuit in partnership with Kiwi Farms, which is an online trolling forum, which is I hadn't come across until recently, trying to make sure that Ofcom has no jurisdiction. And that's going to be a complicated multinational deep lawsuit that is currently ongoing. I just think that it's nonsense. All of the Online Safety Act, if you can get around it with a VPN, it's pointless. If you are just picking on people who don't know how the internet works. And I think you are deeply misunderstanding the contemporary global nationalist international use of the internet that you can so quickly sidestep round with a VPN, as you said. And I don't know how it makes any sense. And you can call it world leading all you want, but ultimately it's just an isolationist, confusing bit of policy that Australia has kind of made work in a different sort of way. Australia is kind of on the front line with us, and the EU is doing it much more softly. But this legislation is investigating everything, finding nothing, and everyone's ignoring them for the moment, at least.
And I mean that, and I mean, why do you think that is? What are they getting wrong about this? Is it just that they're not particularly tech literate? Is it that they? I mean, like I don't understand whether or not they thought that 4chan was like an easy first victim here, and actually just nobody in any of the UK government is aware of anything beyond like Facebook boomer memes that like 65-year-olds share on groups or something.
I think 4chan is the headline, right? Everyone has that ephemeral understanding of 4chan. I hadn't been on 4chan in maybe 3 years until I was researching this. And to the UK government's defence, you can see why it needs to be age-gated. You understand that policy. Like on the front page, there's a lot of adult content. But it's a little bit boomer meme. The internet has moved on. 4chan is not as popular as it once was. And it just needed a headline, but the headline had to be that this company is really struggling rather than it will just shut off UK access. As so many of these sites have just been like not available in the UK, so you have to switch on your VPN, so it will jump into it. I don't know why the government thought this was a good idea to go after 4chan, partly because, as we'll come on to later, like so much of the hacking world, so much of the DDoS stuff runs through not necessarily 4chan, but the people who frequent 4chan and Kiwi Forums are the sorts of people that engage in those sorts of hack attacks.
Yeah, and this is the thing that makes it doubly confusing to me. It's as if, and I find it bizarre in large part because actually, if you look at government comms, at least in the last government, and there was, Cass Horowitz and others were kind of leading on particularly the Conservative communication strategy, which was often kind of shitposting in many ways through advertising. Like they did deliberately bad web designs for their websites. They did really bad graphic design for their social media posts, which was intentional because they were hoping to try and get people talking about it. So there is in some corners of government, and at least in the last government, there was an awareness of the fact that internet trolls existed. Like to me, I guess this comes down to like a really interesting kind of like broader problem at the minute with Keir Starmer's government, which is that it is incredibly staid, incredibly kind of formal and stilted to the extent that he doesn't seem to know that this is all an in-joke. For all that 4chan has really terrible content on there, everybody there is interacting in a really mocking, non-serious way. And so the idea that kind of you're kind of trying to make the internet trolls follow your rules just feels like the biggest Poindexter in the class going up to the class clown and saying, actually, will you kind of just behave a little bit? And actually, you shouldn't be surprised when they say absolutely not. So I am baffled to be honest, and remain baffled. I think it just shows a real naivety in the approach that doesn't do the government well at all in terms of trying to get this off on the right foot. I understand what you say in terms of like there is a kind of a sense in the water of what 4chan is and why that is important and why it's important to kind of be seen to take action on it. But I also think that they had to have known that they would just get repeatedly clowned over this, or they're just walking into kind of a minefield effectively.
But then, and also it comes back to this. So I interviewed the head of the BBFC, the British Board of Film Classification, a few years ago. And most of my questions were about, if you try and regulate digital content in the same way that you regulate old school films, you're instantly screwed unless your budget quintuples, 100x's. And so for Ofcom, if you're going to try and somehow regulate every website, and I appreciate you're going to set up a quota of under 10 million monthly uniques, it's not going to matter. You're running Ofcom's budget into the massive, like if you're launching these 69 investigations now, 70 something, you are running a slow moving investigation into things that will move quickly and just update their policies within weeks. So then you have to start the investigation again. So I would love to know how much money the government has set aside for Ofcom to be able to conduct this. And is it just this poster child that they think that believe will swing elections because of the protection of children? Or is a sort of standard swing voter just annoyed they have to put in a few extra passwords in to skip into a VPN to get into whatever it is that they're watching that evening?
Yeah, and I think that, you're right in that sense, because when this was announced, the kind of Online Safety Act in its previous iterations, and it's gone through, frankly, about half a dozen over the last few years, I remember speaking on the radio about, my concerns about the fact that Ofcom, which already struggles, frankly, to regulate broadcast TV and would have, the ability to actually staff up. And I said there needs to be way more investment into this if they're going to be able to be expected to start to police this sort of stuff. I think the approach that they're taking is maybe they're going for the easy wins as they see it, the kind of most egregious examples and the relatively small, relatively niche ones. Perhaps adult industry aside, where they have focused very much because that is an obvious one. But the challenge that they have is that the big tech firms, at least, are being expected in many ways to self-police and self-report. And, if there's one thing that we have learned over the last 10, 15, 20 years of living under the auspices of big tech, it is that they will not necessarily easily hand over anything that is incriminating, that says, actually, we have done wrong, or they will do so in a very controlled way that makes them look good, but actually perhaps downplays somewhat the impact of what they're doing.
And I was trying to work through that. So Ofcom are very sure there are 3 areas of enforcement: the failure to respond, they're monitoring geo-blocking, so essentially making, if they are not going to conform to these new regulations, they will just shut off the site in the UK, which is, I think, bad for the UK rather than good for Ofcom. And the use of hash matching tech post enforcement, and I have no idea what that means, and it's something to do with illegal images. Do you have any better idea of what that means?
I do. This is one of my favourite subjects because actually it is a vitally important part of the internet, and to the credit of a lot of big tech companies, actually, they do a lot of good work that is often unseen, using hashes to try and keep incriminating, dangerous content, particularly child sexual abuse material or violence, occasionally gore and things like that, off their platforms. So hashing is effectively it's a kind of technical system whereby when you encounter an image that is grossly indecent, so again, horrible violence, images of death, more commonly used for CSAM, child sexual abuse material, you basically attach a hash to it, which is it kind of goes into a database of known images, and the layout and the framing, and also the kind of additional material and sort of metadata that is constantly attached to that image, even if you strip out a lot of the normal metadata that we would know of, is recorded in that database. And it means that by default, many websites that sign up to this hashing regime, which is run by the Internet Watch Foundation, which is a kind of quasi charity NGO slash group of organizations that are funded by big tech companies and the charitable sector. They will run any image that is attempted to be uploaded or passed through their systems through this hash database. If they encounter an image that they have previously seen and is known to be something that is either offensive or offending, then they will remove that or not allow it to happen. And so actually, if you look at the data, we're talking about tens, if not hundreds of millions of images or videos that are stopped from being uploaded, never mind actually appearing on websites or taken down from these platforms every single year. And it's kind of the quiet bit of the internet that often doesn't get talked about, in part just because the material that we're talking about is relatively unpalatable, in part because it is just what you would hope would happen anyway. But actually, there is an awful lot of work that goes into that. So that idea of if you are not signing up to hash matching technology, now, the challenge is, at what scale should you be required to do that? Because it does require investment. It does require a lot of effort. And you have to always be wary of when these rules should come in force. And that's one of the issues that people have with the Online Safety Act, is it puts undue requirements on very small website owners and platform owners. But once you are at a scale where this is something that you ought to be doing, I think that it is a good decision by Ofcom to say, well, actually, you need to sign up to a hashing regime, because if you're not, you run the risk of that content proliferating far easier than it would if it was there.
And so, in principle, would that stop some of the more horrific examples where people are live streaming their illegal acts of it? So there was that mass murderer who went and just put it on live on Facebook, and there was so many critics came after and said, why wasn't this stopped in the first place? Does this stop that happening?
Not live streaming, because it is not something that is already in the database. But if you move quickly, and that is, the perfect example is the Christchurch shooting, right, in 2019, I believe it was, where Meta, or then Facebook, talked about the kind of scale of re-uploads that they saw very shortly afterwards. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was absolutely horrific, the scale that they saw sort of in the hours after the incident happened and the live stream ended. They took down the original, but multiple people re-uploaded and reseeded that on the web. It would potentially stop the re-uploads. It obviously couldn't stop the original ones because the system doesn't look necessarily, it's not like a computer vision system of the type that maybe like a TikTok algorithm is, where it knows, hey, Alex has a pot plant in the background of his video. Here's a machete that he's also wielding as he does on a Thursday evening randomly. Hey, we should take that stuff down. Yeah, exactly. Well, we will try. I'm not saying that you're doing anything with the machete. I'm just saying that you are owning the machete, basically.
Chopping vegetables.
Yeah, exactly. You're trimming your pot plant with it. So yeah, it wouldn't work with the original, but it might work with the re-uploads.
I came into this assuming that you would be hating on all of the online safety act, because I think it is half-assed and poorly thought through, and in essence a move towards censorship. And I think in principle it can be beautiful and wonderful, and you can pretend that you're saving children from aggressive imagery, but I believe it is a step in the wrong direction when it comes to freedom of the internet. And I'm still such a sucker for Tim Berners-Lee, woefully naive vision of the internet as a beautiful, friendly place where everything goes, but everyone is this collegiate, beautiful, happy socialist utopia where everyone gets along. And this feels like it's kicking that idea directly in the balls. You're saying more pragmatically, it could be good, but the way it's implemented is terrible.
Yeah, and also, so it's interesting, the Tim Berners-Lee thing. We, I guess, may try and get him on the podcast at some point, but I will secretly say that his book
your ambition.
I will say that his book is not very good. I have just had to review it, and the book is incredibly, incredibly dull and incredibly poorly written. And he has a ghostwriter for it as well, which makes it even worse, because I can't tell whether or not the ghostwriter has tried to lead Tim Berners-Lee to write a good book, and Tim Berners-Lee has said, no, I'm Tim Berners-Lee, we'll do the book the way that I want it to be done, and actually turns out it's deathly dull, or whether the ghostwriter has just decided that this is the way that the book should be written, and actually it doesn't really work all that well. The Online Safety Act, is very, very imperfect in a bunch of different ways. So number one is it is subject to regulatory capture, right? Yeah, we have, unfortunately, we are in a tricky situation. Industry capture rather than regulatory capture. We are in an unfortunate situation where we're in a kind of awkward phase where we don't have fully tech literate decision makers, but we do have tech literate civil servants behind the scenes trying to push those tech literate decision makers into doing the right sort of thing. And often things get mixed in translation, and also those decision makers, their ears are most often bent by lobbyists within the industry who say, well, actually, you should do this rather than that, which I think is in part why we have the very stringent requirements on ID checks and digital ID checks for websites that benefits the ID checking industry rather than anything else. Go on, you want to interrupt there, Alex?
Oh, the ID check. The Blair has been on about this for 20 years, and then suddenly Starmer gets in, and everyone thinks, no, he's further left than Blair. He's further left. He's going to really innovate in this space. He's really a big human rights fan. Smash 6 months in. Right. The ID, not even self-sovereign identity, which is a more complicated discussion I'm sure we'll have in coming weeks about just what that means in practice around owning your identity and fragmenting what your identity is in digital space. But no, just a more pervasive, complicated eroding of what it means for rights and the right to work and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, sorry, that was slightly off topic.
No, but it's true. It's true. Like that is one of the big challenges. So there is this kind of industry capture. There is also the fact that we are in many ways, I think, developing kind of through the Online Safety Act and particularly through the implementation of it in the last few months. I know that this has been a long, winding process. So I'm not naive in saying that the Online Safety Act was birthed in the last year or so. But Jonathan Haidt has an awful lot to answer for. His book, Anxious Generation, which has been criticised by many scientists that study the impact of social media and technology on young people, has kind of captured the attention of regulators in a way that is maybe not befitting of the strength of its conclusions and the rigor which they are based in science. Jonathan Haidt, by the way, is a good sport on this sort of stuff. I've put those allegations to him that people say, well, your book is sometimes misrepresenting the science or kind of over-representing the conclusions of it. And he goes, well, I think that that's the opposite case, and actually, this is a very rigorous bit of work, and there are kind of very tribal elements happening, I think, at the minute in terms of this stuff. So, we have that kind of looming over us, the spectre of the anxious generation. And I think that's on every politician's summer reading list this year, so they've all kind of ingested it. And then, I think the desire to kind of be seen as simultaneously tougher than the European Union, which is already quite interventionist on tech, because we want to say that is a post-Brexit benefit. Make of that what you will, while also realizing that we have Donald Trump in the White House and his whole thing is make America great again. He's very cozy and very positive about Silicon Valley, and therefore we're trying to kind of straddle two things and not really doing any of them very well.
If taking that book as a broad example, and Instagram is cited, although it denies this, that particularly with young women, young girls, in around between 1 in 3 and 1 in 5 attempted suicides or risk of self-harm or depression. I would assume that the primary target of this act would be those platforms that are open to younger people, and at least there is growing evidence to suggest it might cause harm, but I don't think they're part of this specifically, are they?
No, because they would be not serving adult content. And one of the things that's interesting about Meta products is that they are overly draconian in trying to not allow anything remotely adult at all on their platforms. Carolina Are, who is a really interesting researcher on the sort of censorship of social platforms and how they are just OTT on everything. She frequently has her account blocked all the time. You've read and heard probably about breastfeeding photos not being allowed on Instagram because heaven forbid that they might show some sort of breasts in any way, and that becomes quite dangerous. So yeah, in theory they should not be because they are not showing adult content to minors.
In principle.
In principle.
Right. That is enough for part one. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to Crashed, part two, where we are going to try and take a wider view of something that's come up, but try to take not just this story that will be over in a week, but try to take a bigger picture look at what it might mean. And so this week, cyber attacks, it's been reported, have increased by 50% over the last year. That comes from the UK National Cybersecurity Centre, and there is a significant incident every other day, with 18 classed as highly significant. They're coming from ransomware groups and state-backed outfits like China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. And probably the most high-profile one was M&S, what happened and shut them down for a week or so, maybe a little bit longer. And the Land Rover one, which is now coming to an end, but that shut down their factory for quite some time. Chris, what does it mean?
Well, it means that if you're M&S, then you can lose £300 million in operating profit. So, I mean, that is a significant thing. And I think that it feels like 2025 has been the year where we have woken up as a society to the threat of ransomware and or any kind of hack. I mean, generally these things are ransomware attacks, but the sort of what used to be seen as, oh, well, this doesn't really affect me, has started to affect people, in part because they have either started seeing shells become bare, or because they've been told that their data in some shape or form has been mislaid and now in the hands of people that they don't want it to be. It's kind of interesting to have seen in that data that around about half of those were seen as kind of like nationally significant, a smaller chunk, less than 20, but still 20 is like a lot when you consider the year is not that long, were seen as highly significant, which means that they've kind of had this impact on the government or the economy or whatever. So we're talking, I guess, here an M&S, a Co-op, or a JLR style attack. The JLR one is kind of bizarre, where actually they're having to effectively just halt production, full stop. And so the one problem that I see with this, Alex, is that there's not really a way of solving it. The truth is that you can try and build up your defenses as best as possible, invest huge amounts of money in a way that is useful, but actually you will always fall victim. I always use this really corny analogy, but I think it is an important one. It kind of brings it home to people when you explain it, which is it's that famous threat that I think it was the Provisional IRA made to Margaret Thatcher after the hotel bombing in Brighton, where they said, you got lucky this time, we only have to get lucky once. And that is very much the approach that hackers take, which is they will just bombard anybody and everybody with an attempt to kind of get in. And if you make one single mistake, everything can go wrong.
I think my assumptions when I was going into this was it was going to be exacerbated by automation. So ChatGPT was going to come in and wouldn't make hacking necessarily easier, but would make the process of going through it easier, and means that it would become exponentially quicker, exponentially more easy. You could ask it, what are the easiest targets? What is the biggest impact? All of those sorts of things. And actually, what this report said was that actually AI wasn't. They were all too aware of it coming, and they all were trying to make as many preparations as they could, but it wasn't necessarily having the impact that they thought it would yet. And I was at the Nominet conference a couple of weeks ago giving this sort of speech around the oncoming cybersecurity threat, and I hadn't read that report yet. So I was sort of talking about just how much quantum and AI might impact it in future. I think it still will, but actually that is not as present as I thought it might be.
Yeah, what did the folks at the Nominet conference take out of that? What did they make? Because obviously they are always plugged into this stuff.
I think the interesting thing from their side was they're not quite understanding whether or not the .com.co.uk website will need to remain and what actually and how they can protect themselves in that way. They're more thinking about their IP and what that means in practice. When it comes to security, I think just sign up to Cloudflare. It's such a simple thing. Like if you have Cloudflare, it becomes a lot more difficult. The Cloudflare CEO is really hot on this and does. So Cloudflare is a sort of DDoS protection platform and runs and is a sort of secret partner of most major sites. They're not, at least in that conference, they weren't that equipped for what comes next. But I think that's part of being at that conference. They were trying to find out what happens. And it was really interesting to find out the sorts of people who are still the landlords of the internet almost. It was really interesting to hear from them what was going on there.
Yeah, it's interesting that the NCSC in this report was saying that they thought that AI will kind of break into the cyber hacking space in 2027 and beyond, whereas actually I think that seems quite a generous timeline, if I'm honest, because we had last month ESET, the cybersecurity research company, had kind of found the first instances of ChatGPT, or not ChatGPT, generative AI powered ransomware in the wild, where actually it was just kind of self-sustaining. The kind of concern I think here is that you can put generative AI to work in trying to make a convincing case for someone to hand over or give up access to a system in a way that is really useful for them. One of the kind of biggest weaknesses isn't necessarily ever in the hardware or in the software or in the way that you configure either of those things. It is in the fact that humans in the loop are always going to be making mistakes. We can often be tricked by, someone pretending to be someone else. That is the whole principle behind phishing, or clicking on a link that looks like, a bank's website or an official website or whatever it is. And so, we know, I wrote a story for The Economist about kind of the ability for generative AI chatbots to de-indoctrinate people with conspiratorial views, in part because they can kind of match the energy and echo the language of the person that they are quote unquote speaking to, while also arguing dispassionately and not getting frustrated at those that they're talking about. And so you can imagine that while it's being used for good there, you can imagine it being used in a much more nefarious way by cyber criminals who go, well, actually, yeah, I can just kind of like set up a jailbroken GPT to start talking to this person and pretend to be tech support and figure out all the different ways that I can weasel in.
Even deeper than that, though, so CrowdStrike bought Pangea for $250 million 2 weeks ago. Do you know about that? They're a prompt injection attack protection company, because it turned out that if you not with the big LLMs, but if you're building a proprietary LLM, often you haven't got the coding base for it, and you can ask your LLM how to hack it, and it will tell you. And there is because unless you could like show me the source code, show me where your vulnerabilities are, show me where your company's vulnerabilities are, and it will do it. And this is worth $250 million to CrowdStrike. So actually, that shows where we're at in this, and that money is willing to be spent. I don't think there is that level of demand yet, but you can see where it's going. I don't know how you would hack an LLM to profit from it, but I can understand how a ransomware, if you've taken over your newly built chatbot, that's probably worth paying to get it back.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one way that might be useful, if you're thinking about a proprietary LLM, that it could be, again, this is me being devious now and thinking that actually I'm in the wrong industry. I should just get away from journalism and become a cyber criminal, because I can think of immediately like 5 different ways that could work. But if you have
Hold on, what are the 5 ways?
Yeah, well, if you have a proprietary LLM, well, maybe let me give you one. If you have a proprietary LLM that is run by a business into which you are inserting kind of company secrets or proprietary data, getting back out the stuff that is put in might be beneficial to a cyber criminal, because you might have usernames and passwords put in at best, or at worst rather, the easiest thing, the kind of most disappointing outcome, if you can get an LLM to spit out whatever a user has last fed it, or to recall whatever it's last fed it, could be kind of the big announcement that they're going to make in a month's time that moves the markets, and you can capitalize on that. So there are, I think, real risks here, and one of the challenges is that um, there is, unless you are particularly technically minded and are really keen on using this stuff, there is, I think, a sort of belief that computers are infallible and therefore LLMs are infallible. And so you kind of forget that actually, things can go wrong with them. And so you become much more trusting in terms of what you're sharing with them in a way that can backfire if, as as you point out, like prompt injection can spit out some pretty bad stuff, or even just jailbreaking it was, rather than spending $250 million on this one company, I think that Cloudflare could have better spent their money giving
CrowdStrike was the one that bought this.
Yeah,
Yep.
CrowdStrike could better spend their money giving it and trying to hire a guy called Pliny the Elder on Twitter, on X, because he is the user that seems to always just manage to jailbreak all of this stuff in a matter of seconds. Whenever a model comes out, he is like, yep, I have jailbroken it. And I think that he's probably doing relatively well from the revenue sharing on Twitter that Elon Musk has set up, because his posts always go viral. But I think that probably they could offer him a bit more money than Elon might give them through the kind of, here's your million views that you got on X this last month. Here's a few £100 or whatever it is.
You're still an X.
Right, I linger. I find it is unpalatable, but somewhere that I have to be because of the space in which I am in. Not the far right space, but the tech space.
I think there is still value. Same as Facebook Marketplace is hilarious. Facebook itself is hilarious. Facebook is just baiting me into, you have new memories to look back on today. Dear Facebook, I've already deleted every single post. There are no possible way that there can be memories, but I appreciate your work. I think with hacking, actually, I don't know, is hacking going to get worse before it gets better, or are now companies are taking it so seriously? And there are so many different versions of the cybersecurity insurance going around. Does that mean that it will become harder or easier to hack into at least the big companies in future?
Easy to hack in, but I guess the challenge is, do we start to see shifts in how companies are required and mandated to respond to this? We have seen conversations, and they are becoming more active conversations around governments saying, well, you as a company, if you are hacked, you must no longer, quote unquote, negotiate with the terrorists. You're not allowed anymore to pay up ransoms. And I think the UK government is considering making that a law in the next few months. It's been kind of debated and discussed, and certainly I've seen reporting on that becoming a possibility. If that becomes the case, it's less so the insurance thing, because you ultimately, like, you can get a payout from your insurance company to try and reinstate all of the stuff that is broken, but actually you can't necessarily recover that data unless you pay the ransom. If you stop paying the ransom, then it does become less attractive, I suppose, for a ransomware attacker to try and sort of lasso up all of your stuff and keep it secret. But I'm not convinced that you won't just find wily ways around that, like equivalent of kind of asking a friend to lend you a fiver. Can you send 3,000 Bitcoin to this random address that I've had flashing up in red on my screen, and just don't tell anybody?
That's 300 Bitcoin. What sort of millionaire people are paying these ransom?
Well, precisely, right? Like that is the thing. So it's kind of, I understand. Again, this is another example actually of the government identifying that something is an issue, trying to provide a solution that, in theory makes sense, but in practice probably doesn't, which is, yes, we should stop people paying ransoms, because ultimately if you stop people paying ransoms, then you massively disincentivize the attackers to do this, because they don't really care who or what they are attacking. They only care if they get paid. And if they find it harder to get paid, then maybe they don't attack anymore. But in practice, like, I just don't see it happening. And I don't know what the answer is. I'm one of those people who likes to heckle from the sidelines and say this is wrong, but doesn't have an actual solution to it because it is a very tricky problem. That's why I talk to all these experts and speak to them instead.
That is a journalist prerogative. We just ask the questions. We're not meant to know the answers.
Yeah.
Although I do think we're about to hit now that the Windows 10 is now being mothballed as of 2 days ago. So I think that could cause a jump if people haven't updated their IT systems, particularly in like really ye organizations that haven't updated properly, which you think would never happen, but probably still does.
Well, you think wouldn't happen, but also this, there's kind of two sides to this coin, which is that, yes, it's bad that they're stopping support and people are very up in arms about it because actually there are some organizations that are still running Windows 10 rightly or wrongly, and many individuals that are still doing that. But again, malicious actors will always look for the ways to try and leverage this sort of stuff. And they're going, well, if you're saying that the end of Windows 10 is happening in terms of its support, that is a way that I can craft a phishing email. And they will say, oh, this is coming to an end, but actually we have a special offer. Microsoft is giving you the opportunity to do this. All you need to do is insert your credit card information here for one simple payment, and we'll give you an extra year or whatever. You will find some people, particularly, I suppose, if they aren't updating this sort of stuff and they're not that literate in terms of what they're doing in terms of technology, they might well find themselves doing that. So, every kind of either well-intentioned or not approach to this sort of stuff and saying, you really do need to stay up to date here, can also be weaponized in the opposite direction and cause its own headaches.
Also, we're only on Windows 11. Obviously, I have not been on Windows for a decade. I didn't realize that we're only on Windows 11. No, who cares about the numbers? 24H2. That feels wildly short-sighted to mothball Windows 10. Anyway, that is. Although I couldn't tell you which version of Mac OS is currently supported, probably only the last 4. That's quite enough about ransomware and about criminal groups and state-backed authorities. We'll be back in 1 minute. Final quick section, and we've subtitled it "What Crashed," and it feels hammy and it feels cliche, and we were trying to think about why we called it Crashed, and that's because we're both cynical fuckers. But we're trying to squeeze in something that is at least directly to the brand name. So, Chris, what or who has crashed this week?
The government IT system and whoever is in charge of it, I think, based on what we have learned around China's access to UK government IT systems between around about 2020 and 2025. So this is obviously the sort of second day story of the odd collapse of the China spies trial, where one parliamentary researcher and one academic are alleged to have been handing over secrets to China. They both deny the charges, and actually that is no longer really the story. The story now is claims by Dominic Cummings and also backed up by several other people and reported in various outlets that China, as well as I think Russia, have been basically snooping on government communications, including some relatively secretive classifications of documents. And so it's a pretty bad day for whoever was responsible for that. Although, again, I do have to point out, you shouldn't be surprised that this is happening. Like, every country is spying on everyone else, and no system is impenetrable. So there was a little bit of kind of naivety, I think, by some people saying, well, isn't it shocking that this has happened? I think, yes, we should be surprised at how often it seems to have happened and how deep it seems to have run. But you would be a bad government and a bad spy agency if you weren't trying to get access to central government decision making.
I mean, I oversaw a big series for Newsweek on it in 2023 about just how much effort China was putting. There was a full covert China series, and it was all about the worldwide influence operations. So it is zero surprise to me that Britain is part of that as a key way into Europe, a key way into one of the biggest economies. And with Beijing and China's will they won't their relationship with the UK and Osborne's, so what was it, golden generation, golden era, whatever it was called, and now a little bit more frosty. I think, to my point, the person who crashed this week was Kemi Badenoch, because on this story, Badenoch accused Starmer of not being transparent about it and not doing anything in PMQs this week. And the first answer Starmer gave was firstly calling Badenoch out for direct quotes of things she said when a government minister, and then he said, fine, we'll release all of the documents. Every single document, all of the witness statements, exactly how they've come to this ruling. And then for the next 3 or 4 questions, she continued as if he hadn't said anything, as if she had the list of questions and wasn't going to be moved from them at all, which has been roundly criticised from the BBC and elsewhere about just what she was doing. But even the MI5 chief today is frustrated with that ruling, and so I think that story has so much longer to run.
Yeah, it's going to be one that I think we might be talking about more in future episodes.
So that is episode 1 of this pilot of a thing, which may be published. We don't know yet. So if you're listening to it, then obviously we have. But we are planning to do this weekly for a little bit to see what, and then, we're going to talk to Tim Berners-Lee, obviously, in the next few days. It's going to be easy. I mean, Nick Clegg has got a book out, so I'm desperately trying to talk to him. Like, hey, Nick. Oh, no, he was at Ilkley Book Festival last week, but we are still figuring out what we are doing with it. If you think had any ideas, if you loved it, if you hated it, if you had any feedback for us, if you want to see more of something, less of something, anything else, we are journalists, quick to change, fail quickly, iterate, all that crap. But otherwise, thank you for listening. Welcome to Crashed.